Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to start with a new thinker in this course, Karl Marx, and like many other thinkers in the course, we are going to have 3 lectures on Marx. In the lecture today, that is the first lecture, we will discuss briefly his intellectual political context, his brief biography, and will focus more on his theory of historical materialism. That is the way to interpret history or to interpret or understand major changes and transformation that have taken place in the history of mankind. So, historical materialism in Marxist understanding is the way or the method to understand such historical changes and transformations. So, today we will focus on that. In the second lecture on Marx, we will particularly focus on his theory of class or class struggle or his theory of state, but we will also spend a few minutes in that lecture on his theory of alienation or exploitation that necessitates the class struggle in any society. So, we will discuss that in the second lecture, and in the concluding lecture on Marx, we will start with discussing his theory of politics and why he regards politics as a tool for class exploitation to resolve the class conflict, and what would be the role of politics in his imagination of communist society, which would be a classless society where there would be no private property, and in the absence of private property there would not be any conflict. So, do we need politics in that kind of society? What was his views on politics particularly? We will focus on that in the concluding lecture on Marx before discussing the critical interpretation or the criticism that is leveled against Karl Marx and his political thought. So, let us start this lecture today. And when we discuss Karl Marx, many of you must have heard him before. The uniqueness or the specificities of Marxist thinking is not merely to understand the society or politics, but change it. So, in that sense, unlike other thinkers in the course, which did play a role in and their thought and theorization did play a role in the making of modern state or the making of modern polity or the understanding of human being, their natural rights and so on. Yet historically speaking, in terms of making historical changes or transformation to the large scale through a movement, through a kind of revolution, Marx and Marxist philosophy remains oriented towards the practical side of it. So, in Marxist famous dictum that the philosophy and the role of philosophy is not merely to help human being understand his context, but also enable him to change it. So, the major emphasis in Marxist thought and thinking was to not just interpret the world, but also how to change it in a manner that would lead to more freedom and real emancipation. So, we will see in that 3 lectures that we are going to have that there is a kind of a misconception, I will say, about reducing Marx merely to some kind of reductionist or deterministic kind of theorist, where he was, like Enlightenment thinkers, a kind of more humanist or developing thought and theories to create a condition for the greater emancipation or the more freedom for the individual. In doing that, he focused more on the practical part of it or the practical side of theory, thought or philosophy. So, Karl Marx was the most influential thinker of the 19th century, and more importantly in the 20th century, where many revolutions such as Russian Revolution, if you have read, or the Chinese Revolution derived inspiration from the Marxist writing and Marxist philosophy. So he was the most influential thinker of the 19th and whole of the 20th century, and no other thinker in the history of political thought has shaped the historical events, the real historical transformative events or changes that as Marx's writings or philosophy did. And also, no other thinker is as despised or worshipped. So, about Marx, there is this rejection of his philosophy and worshipping of the philosophy. So, there is a kind of a cult figure or a kind of icon making or symbolism associated with Marx and his writings. So, on the one hand, he is despised and his philosophy is rejected as utopian, or which leads to bloody revolution and so on. On the other hand, you have a kind of religious like worshipping of Marx and his writings without critically subjecting his thoughts and ideas to the rational scrutiny. So, there is this both kind of approach to Marx and his writings, where on the one hand he is despised, on the other hand he is worshipped by millions of followers across the world. Profoundly influenced by Hegelian philosophy, Marx was committed to the creation of a rational world order which would bring about the emancipation of whole humanity, and this he shares with many Enlightenment thinkers, right. The whole purpose of the reason and rationality and human life is to create the condition for freedom in which he or she can fully develop himself or herself. And whole Enlightenment project was to construct a state, to build a society where human being would realize that kind of freedom. So, the classical economists give one kind of understanding. The other thinkers like Kant, Hegel, they argued about other forms of such society. Rousseau was talking about a general will and so on. In that paradigm, Marx was also looking for creating the conditions for human emancipation or human freedom. However, he, unlike many other Enlightenment thinkers, realized the limited emancipation or freedom that has been achieved through political revolution. So, the real emancipation or freedom is possible only through the social and economic transformation, and not merely by changing the laws or political revolution. So, in other words, Marx, like many other Enlightenment thinkers, were committed to the ideal of human freedom. So, that is at the center of Marxist philosophy and Marxist thought, that how to create a condition, a rational world order or political order in which human being can be true to himself, realize his or her human essence, that is doing something which is the realization, or if you recall Hegelian idea, actualization of his self or his own will. But unlike many Enlightenment thinkers and scholars who saw in political revolutions such as French Revolution or the recognition of individual rights. So, this was also the period when individual is regarded as the rational subject, and therefore he or she should have certain inalienable rights, and a political society and the state emerged to protect those rights, to guarantee those rights. Now, in contrast to such faith and trust in the individual rights or political revolution, Marx argued that the real freedom is possible only in the state of communism, and this state of communism, he defines it with the absence of private property. So, there is no private property in that state. But if you recall other thinkers that we have done in this course like Locke or even Hegel, the property or the private property is the necessary, and individual agree to live in the state by contracting with others who are equal and free members to protect their life, liberty and property. So, property is the necessary condition and it must be protected by the state, whereas Marx imagine a kind of collective life where there would be no private property, and if there is no private property, there is no conflict. So, real freedom or emancipation is possible to realize or achieved only in communism, with the absence of private property, and then there would be no politics or class conflicts. In such a society, he thought the state would wither away, and there would be a kind of self-regulating mechanism among the individual. These theory we will discuss when we will discuss his views on communism later on in this lecture. So, Karl Marx's philosophy, many scholars argue, is based on a kind of faulty premise of economic determinism. That is to say, for Marx, material conditions of man determine their social and political existence, including their self-consciousness. So, Marx considered himself as the materialist thinker, and many left-leaning young Hegelians was critical of Hegel's philosophy precisely because of his focus on ideas as at the center of dialectics that moves history from one stage to the next. Marx, as a materialist thinker, believes that the matter is at the center of the dialectics, and human history moves according to the changes in the material conditions of man. So, it is the material, social, economic conditions which determines the consciousness of the individual, not the other way around, as Hegel argued. However, this deterministic or reductionist argument leads many scholars to criticize much of Marx's thought and idea. There is also the criticism of his theory of revolution, which he thought was inevitable. So, we will discuss how he argued that because of the class conflict and inner conflict that is prevalent in the capitalism, it would inevitably lead to the next stage that he calls communism through revolution, and he wanted it to happen in the advanced countries. But it never happened in the advanced industrial economies, and in mostly agrarian economies where such revolution happened, such as in Russia or in China, it often paved the way for authoritarianism. And in other words, if you look at historically, these revolutions proved to be a failure to create that condition of life which Marx argued would be possible to live in the life of communism. So, often these revolutions turned into a kind of authoritarian regime, not necessarily creating the condition of life which Marx argued in the communism. However, over the decades and centuries, there developed many schools within Marxism that developed his philosophy further, often by challenging it, often by including newer dynamics to it, by focusing more on the other aspect rather than the economic determinism or what is called the scientific law in Marx and so on. So, over the decades and century, there developed many schools within Marxism which interpret it in a varieties of ways, not necessarily reducing it to the economic determinism and the reductionist understanding of Marx. This will come back to discuss when we will start discussing criticism to Karl Marx's political thought. Okay, now let us look at the political and the intellectual context of Marx, and we have to begin with the influence or the intellectual influence on his writings. So, if we look at the philosophy of Marx, which we find is profoundly shaped by German idealism, as we have discussed, and particularly Hegelian philosophy. So, German idealism is a school of thought which is said to be started or founded by Immanuel Kant with his writings on three critiques and enlightenment and categorical imperative. All those were part of such school or tradition of thought which later developed as the German idealism, where there is a kind of primacy of idea, will, human freedom and so on. So, Marx's political philosophy was profoundly shaped by German idealism, particularly Hegelian philosophy, which is a kind of culmination of German idealism. And in Hegelian philosophy, well, we have also discussed that how Hegel also, in a sense, combine this divide between idealism and materialism. So, any ideas or abstract will, according to Hegel, must manifest itself in the real concrete historical circumstances, and it is through such manifestation that idea is realized. So, in that sense, the real ideas is immaterial merely in the realm of abstract thought and imagination. It must manifest socially, historically. So, there is this then possibilities of such material explanation or interpretation, but again according to young Hegelians or left Hegelians, Hegel gave privacy still to the ideas. So, Marx's philosophy was deeply influenced by German idealism, particularly Hegel's philosophy. And if you particularly look at his early writings, where he developed his ideas like alienation, objectification of labor, human emancipation or communism, were developed through his engagement with Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. So, for the rest of life, Marx went on to further develop these thoughts, particularly his ideas of communism, which he first articulated in Economic and Philosophical Manuscript of 1844. So, he went on to give it a more scientific, more historical material explanation, and moved away from Hegel eventually. But these ideas were shaped as a result of his engagement with Hegelian philosophy. So, he further explained it or developed it through his engagement with the works of classical economists like Adam Smith and others, and French Revolution. So, in Marxist philosophy or political thought, you have the combination of three tradition or intellectual tradition, if you like: German idealism on the one hand, classical economist on the other, and French socialism the third. So, these combination of three traditions or intellectual tradition shaped much of Marx's political philosophy, and there is then the contribution of Marx also, particularly his understanding of the pitfalls or many internal conflicts that exist in the capitalism, and why it is necessary to achieve the next stage of human progress, human development that is possible in communism. So, intellectually then there is a kind of shift in Marx's writings or Marx's philosophy, where it is divided into two kind of writings or philosophy. So, there is a young humanist Marx who focuses on human alienation, how to achieve human emancipation, and what should be the solution to the exploitation and so on. And matured Marx, or what is called the scientific Marx, where he moves away from the Hegelian influence to much more political and economic explanation of the society, polity, and the world order and so on. So, intellectual and political upheavals in the 18th and 19th century Europe, with its promises of freedom and equality, that's become the central theme of the Enlightenment tradition, how to achieve equality among the men, because they are all rational, created by the same God, therefore have same natural rights. So, the freedom and equality becomes the kind of central theme or promise of Enlightenment tradition, and this coincided with the industrial society and the growth of capitalism. And the growth of capitalism created economic inequalities and divided the society into the classes. So, if you remember, when there was the Enlightenment tradition and their faith on human reason and rationality, there was also romantics who argued about going back to the nature, or going back to the pre-industrial life of harmony or mutual dependence and so on. So there was this kind of churning at the level of ideas, at the intellectual level, as to how to respond to the economic disparities or subhuman condition that most of the workers in the industrial society lives. Marx tries to address these economic inequalities and disparities, which leads to class conflicts in many societies. And if you look at the period between 1830 to whole of 19th century, but certainly till 1848, even the Glorious Revolution in UK in 1888, there was the constant movement and churning at the level of political and social mobilization as well. It was also a period of expansion of right to vote, universal vote, and also the recognition of individual rights and so on. And this movement politically and in the realm of social as well continued throughout the 19th and 20th century. So many progressive laws for the protection of laborers, for equal wage, for minimum wage and so on, achieved through those struggles. And the inspiration for such struggles comes from Marxist writing or political philosophy as well. So these economic inequalities that divided the society into the classes and which leads to class conflicts, Marx was devoted to examining the source of such inequalities and means and modes of overcoming them. So unlike romantics or idealists, Marx believed in the reality of matter, and on the basis of that wanted to develop a scientific theory, a kind of theory of history which would help the society or the community to achieve more freedom or greater emancipation. So the purpose of Marx was then to understand or examine the source of inequalities in the capitalist industrial society and how it can be overcome. So in that sense, contrary to his popular image of a revolutionary thinker, Marx was a humanist committed to human emancipation and the full realization of freedom for everyone. So in the capitalist industrial society, the freedom or the political right that was available or the equality that was recognized was in the real practical sense exercised by those who had the property. And the nature of capitalism is such that it would lead to monopolization. So the few will earn more, control more wealth, and the majority of them will be dependent on their scope for working in the factory or live a kind of subhuman existence. So they will not get the work they want to do, they will not get employment and so on, and that is how capitalism survives or thrives. So Marx was trying to follow from the Hegelian idea of movement in the history as seen as a kind of movement of progress from a limited to the more progress or more freedom for the human being. He realized that capitalism is not the final stage. It must be transcended to the next stage of human emancipation and freedom, which he called communism. So in that sense, contrary to the popular perception about Marx as a revolutionary thinker, and he wanted bloody revolution at all cost to achieve communism, he was looking for the condition of life which would be much more emancipatory and free for everyone in the society and not just few who own the property. And how to avoid then the class conflicts, economic disparities, which would make political and legal equality more real for everyone in the society, and then they can develop their own self according to their own talent without exploitation, without control by the other. So Karl Marx, while acknowledging the contribution of French Revolution, argued that freedom and equality that it achieves is only partially successful it achieved them only in the realm of politics and law. So, many of the political development in 19th century and whole of the 20th century is such a realization across the world about equality and freedom. So, in the real sense, it is still not achieved. So, there is the hierarchy which exists even today. Yet, at the level of ideas, at the level of imagination, whole of the 19th and 20th century is a struggle for equality. That is, in principle, everyone realizes that men and women across the race, across the class should be treated equally, should be treated fairly, and they should have certain rights which is given to them because of them being human, not because they own property or they have certain other qualifications and so on. So, to make that fully accessible for everyone, Marx was thinking about a condition of life which would transcend the capitalism, which is based on private property, which controlled by few and left many to live the condition of servitude or subhuman life. So, he realized that the French Revolution or the political realization of the individual rights or recognition of the individual rights achieved freedom to certain extent. It is limited in the realm of politics and law. The real possibilities or actualization of freedom is possible when human beings are socially and economically free as well. So, in the absence of social and economic freedom, Marx argued, political and legal freedom and equality are meaningless. And politically, if you look at the history of Europe, 1848 saw many revolutions across the Europe, and this revolution also represented the struggle between two classes, the earlier feudal lords or monarchs with the mercantile capitalist classes which was emerging and asserting their superiority over the feudal lords and nobility because of their technological innovation and new modes of production that was also happening. So, the year 1848 saw many revolutions in Europe, and Marx believed them as the epochal moments. Although it never materialized, Marx and his philosophy became the symbol of workers' emancipation across the Europe and beyond. So, this was also the period when there was the growing assertion not just among the mercantile class or the feudal lords or the monarchy, which was by then somewhat established, that is the industrial revolution and the emerging class of mercantile capitalist asserted their superiority. However, the working class or the peasantry were largely subjugated, and they began to develop consciousness or began to struggle for their rights, and that leads to many upheavals across the Europe in 1848, as we have discussed while discussing Hobbes in the case of England or Locke in the case of England. Similarly, in France or in other countries in Europe, such development was taking place. Marx saw in them as a kind of movement towards the next stage of history, which actually never materialized the way Marx thought during his lifetime and also after his death. But certainly in Eastern Europe or many other non-European countries, revolution have taken place, but these societies remain not, as Marx thought, advanced industrial society. They were largely agrarian society or partially industrial society. So, nonetheless, the significance of Marx is that, and his writing is that, for the workers and their struggle for emancipation or for greater rights, Marx remained the kind of symbol of inspiration and motivation. Now, if you look at Karl Marx brief biography, Karl Marx was born in Trier, Germany in 1818 in a middle class Jew family, and at that time anti-Semitism was rife, and to escape the humiliation and discrimination, his family converted to Protestant branch of Christianity. His father was a successful lawyer, and Marx, initially tutored by his father and had his early education in Trier, His father wanted him to study law, so he was sent to University of Bonn. However, finding him inattentive towards studies, his father sent him to the University of Berlin, where he was expected to study law, but he changed or switched to philosophy, in which he completed his doctorate. And Marx could not find a job after completing his PhD and began to write a newspaper, Zeitung, in Cologne in 1842. It is at the University of Berlin that Marx came into close contact with Hegelian philosophy and radical leaning left Hegelians, and his thought was profoundly shaped by them. However, soon he also developed criticism against the young Hegelians who were focusing exclusively on religion and religious orthodoxy, whereas Marx wanted the radical and emancipatory potential of Hegelian philosophy to be applied to understand and transform the then prevailing exploitative socio-economic and political order in Europe. So, there was a kind of inspiration from the Hegelian philosophy or the young Hegelians, but he also developed criticism against them because of their focus on religion and religious orthodoxy alone, whereas Marx wanted Hegelian philosophy to be applied in the realm of society and polity as well, to make it more emancipatory, to make it free for most of its inhabitants, not just the few who own the property. As a reporter of Rheinland Zeitung, he was very critical of Prussian government, which led to the closure of this newspaper, and to avoid persecution, Marx left for Paris, where he came into close contact with French socialist thinkers, and he also met his friend and a lifelong collaborator Friedrich Engels, who was himself the son of an industrialist who had a factory in Manchester, and because of his influence, like Marx, of young Hegelians and radical left, he was very critical of industrial society or capitalism, and he became lifelong collaborator of Marx. Marx wrote economic and philosophical manuscript in Paris, which is also known as Paris manuscript, and in this text Marx appeared to be much more humanitarian in comparison to his later works. However, this text was only published in the middle of the 20th century. So, to avoid persecution, Marx had to leave Paris in 1845, and the next 3 years he spent in Brussels. In 1847, the Communist League was formed in London, and Marx was made the founder member of the League. He also wrote its manifesto, which is famously known as Communist Manifesto, or the Manifesto of the Communist Party. Soon he was expelled from Brussels, and after staying briefly in Cologne, Marx settled for good in England, and he studied classical economists like Adam Smith and many others at the British Museum, and worked on his monumental Capital, which is published now in 3 volumes. However, the first volume alone was published during his lifetime in 1867. The other 2 volumes were later edited and published by Engels. He was also associated with the international working class movement, which splintered after the death of Marx and Engels. Marx died in England in 1883. So, he had a kind of very vagabond life, if you like. So, he constantly moved from one country to other, and yet committed to the ideal of communism, or creating the condition for the emancipation or freedom of the working class. Major works of Marx was Economic and Philosophical Manuscript, Thesis on Feuerbach, the German Ideology, the Poverty of Philosophy, the Manifesto of the Communist Party, Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Capital in 3 volumes, and the Critique of Goethe Program. Some of the text he wrote in collaboration with Engels. Now, we move on to his idea of historical materialism, and which is necessary to understand Marx's thought and philosophy. So, it is said to be based on what is called the scientific theory of history, that is to say that there is a kind of certainty determining influence on the movement of history. So, this historical materialism is also regarded as the scientific theory in Marx, which is inspired by Hegelian dialectics, and it explains basically how society works and how it changes from one stage to the next stage over the time. So, through historical materialism, Marx explains different stages of history. So, how a particular stage of history functions and operates within its epoch, and what gradually leads to its change over the time. So, in contrast to Hegel, however, so if you remember Hegelian dialectics, there is the simultaneous presence of contradictions at any given moment of time, and that reality in that moment is constituted of the conciliation of those contradictions, and the next that conciliation would lead to further contradiction, which would lead to further synthesis and so on, and that is how human history moves. However, in contrast to Hegel, for whom the center of such dialectics is the idea or the human thought, Marx argued that the center of any progressive movement in history is matter, and in that sense Marx clearly established himself as the materialist thinker, in contrast to the Hegelian philosophy or Hegel as the idealist thinker or idealist philosopher. Marx saw himself as the matter, and matter is the true guide of any science or theory of society and politics, not the ideal or the idealism or the world of abstract thought and ideas. So, for Marx, the center of such dialectics that moves history from one stage to next is not the ideas as Hegel argued, but the matter, and that is his biggest criticism to Hegel, whom he regarded as the idealist, which leads to logical mysticism in the realm of ideas, consciousness, or mysterious doctrines. Whereas Marx believed in the primacy or absoluteness of the matter, and he considered that as at the center of the dialectics that moves history. The focus on matter and its primacy can be best exemplified in his critique of political economy, where he wrote that it is not the consciousness of man that determines their existence, but on the contrary their social existence that determines their consciousness. So, in Hegelian thought, the will or the the abstract will must be free or source of right, but that will must manifest itself in the real concrete historical will. Nonetheless, the abstractness of the will is supreme, which is abstract, which is in the realm of ideas, which is in the realm of thought, which gradually and progressively manifests itself in different realms of life, in the families, civil society and the state. Whereas for Marx, it is not the consciousness that determines the social existence of the man, but it is the social existence that determines their consciousness. So, it is like other way round of Hegelian dialectics or imagination of self or self consciousness vis-a-vis the social existence or the historical existence of man. So, according to Marx, the most basic fact to understand about any society is the nature of its economic organization. So, if you understand a society and its economic organization, the way it operates and the way it determines the social relationship in the society, then you can understand the larger dynamics that is shaping the social, political, economic organization in the society, the exploitations that are taking place, and how then to overcome those exploitation and create the condition for greater freedom and emancipation. So, for Marx, then the most basic fact about any society is the nature of its economic organization, and this economic organization is also referred to as the modes of production, and this is fundamental to understand the working or the functioning of any society. Now, these are some of the technical terms which you should be aware of you engage with Marx's writings and thought. So, the modes of production is the combination of two things: means of production and the relations of productions. And means of production is the basically raw materials, land, machines, capital, and other tools and labor that helps in the production. So, the modes of production is means of production, and also the relations of production that determines who owns what and who does which job. In that sense, it determines the relationship between man and man. So, who in the society are privileged or the ruling class, and who in the society do all kind of job and yet live exploited life, the life of servitude, without owning any property and yet doing work all the time. So, the relations of productions is based on whether a person own that property or not, or the ownership of means of production determines the class positions of the individual in the society. So, the modes of production which is necessary to understand the society and its nature is constitutive of these two things: means of productions and relations of production. Means of production is the raw materials, capital, land, machines, and so on. Relations of production is whether that person owns or do not own that means, and that determines the class position of that individual in the society. So, of course, in any real society, this relations of production is complicated. However, Marx argued that it fundamentally divides the society into two main classes, which he called haves and have-nots. So, those who own the property and those who do not own the property, and these are the two fundamental classes. So, in the Marxist explanation of social class, there is two main fundamental class in the society: those who own the property and those who do not. However, and we will discuss it more when we discuss his views on class and politics, the role of middle class, which actually sustained democracy, is somewhat not given that much importance in the Marx writing. For him, the fundamental classes in the society is just the two: those who own and those who do not own, and that leads to many scholars criticize his preference for proletariat as the agent of change, and that we'll discuss when we will discuss his views on class. So, for Marx, these relations of productions, he acknowledged though the complexities at any given society, but it fundamentally divides that society into two classes: have and have-nots, and in the capitalist system these are called bourgeoisie and the proletariat respectively. So, fundamental to understand Marx's description of historical materialism is his theory of economic determinism, or what is also called base superstructure model. So, this economic determinism or base superstructure model argues that the economic organization of the society is at the base. So, if you understand the modes of production, that's the center, that's the base of any society, which governs and determines the superstructure. And the superstructure are its laws, government, education, religion, arts, beliefs, and values. So, you can develop the theory or understanding of the society by looking at these things: laws, whether law treats everyone fairly or equally or not, whether the government protects the interest of everyone or not, or education, religion, arts, beliefs, and values similarly. However, for Marx, fundamental to the understanding of a society and its functioning is to understand its modes of production, the base, that is the social and the economic relationship between man and man, depending upon their ownership of property, ownership of means of production. So, in Marx, in that sense, the understanding of society methodologically allow you to understand the hidden things that is determining the laws, government, education, and so on and so forth in any given society. Once you understand its fundamental structure, that its modes of production, are what is called the economic base. Explaining this, Marx writes that in the social production of their life, man enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. So, what they will doesn't matter or does not matter in determining their actual real existence in the society or in the economy. Relations of production which corresponds to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. So, the sum total of these relations of productions constitute the economic structure of society or the real base on which rises a legal and a political superstructure and to which corresponds definite forms of social consciousness. So, the modes of production which is the real base determines the superstructure. So, even the social consciousness that you have or the political superstructure that you come across or you see in the society is determined by this base or economic structure, which is also called the modes of production. So, the mode of production of material life conditions the social, political and the intellectual life process in general. That is in other way looking at the relationship between the base and the superstructure. In the simple term, you can understand it by the economic base, that is the modes of production, determines the superstructure, the nature of laws, government, education, religion, beliefs, general consciousness that exist in the society is in direct proportion to the social base or the economic base of that society. So, Marx, like Hegel, believed that history is a progressive, not circular movement from a limited to a more emancipatory stage of history. If you recall Machiavelli or even different forms of government in Aristotle, there is a kind of circular movement. So, from one stage to the next stage you come back to the foundational movement. So, Machiavelli argued it in his views on republic, where there is the start of the republic, there is the foundational ideas which leads to corruption, and that corruption leads to the rise of a strong prince, and that prince will again create the republican institution, and that circle will continue. In contrast to that circular movement, you have a kind of linear movement in history in Marx, which is progressive from one stage to the next stage, and the next stage is the stage of greater freedom or more emancipation than the previous one. So, these stages of human history for Marx are from the primitive communism to slavery, to feudalism, to capitalism, and capitalism, according to Marx, is not the final stage of history. It must pave the way for communism, which will come after a brief period of what he calls the dictatorship of proletariat, which will work and fight for the protection of the interest of proletariat against the capitalist interest. So, Marx also talked about Asiatic mode of production or Oriental despotism, which he eventually discarded as static and lacking internal dynamism for any change. So, besides these stages of history, that is primitive communism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism to finally an ultimate stage of human emancipation in communism, Marx also talked about Asiatic mode of production or Oriental despotism. However, he discarded those modes of production because he thought those were static, did not have the internal dynamics for change and transformation as it was there in, say, from slavery to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism. So, therefore, he thought those are static or not contributing in moving history from one stage to the next stage. And that kind of understanding was in Marx the basis for his justification of British rule in India. So, he regarded it exploitative, but considered it necessary to bringing India out of its deep slumber. In Marx, however, in his historical materialism, focus was mainly on feudalism to capitalism and how the internal conflicts within capitalism which is the the main focus of his studies, certainly in the capital 3 volumes, would pave the way for a truly emancipatory free society, which he calls communism. So, primitive communism, according to Marx, was a classless society without any private property. So, everyone collectively owned the resources in the society. So, there is the absence of private property in the primitive stage of communism. And this stage of life is characterized by the scarcity. So, human beings were constantly trying to fulfill their needs, and there was the struggle for mere survival, just to protect your life or meet your basic needs was the utmost concern for the human being, and everyone was in that struggle for the survival. In this primitive communism, where there is no private property and no technological advancement, certainly no major technological advancement, slave society emerged as the first class society, with the slave owners living off the labor performed by the slaves. So, that is the emergence of class society, where the slave owners now live off on the labor performed by the slaves. Now, settled agriculture gradually paved the way for the rise of feudalism, and in feudalism the peasants and the serf did all the work on the land. However, the land, which is the basis of all production in feudalism, was controlled by nobles and the warlords. And this ownership of land, where most of the labor is performed by the serf or the peasant, and yet the nobles and the lords lead a prosperous life, or controlling the serfs or the peasants through their control of land. And such ownership was the source of exploitation, which was sanctified by the medieval church and the monarchies. So, the medieval monarchies was based on the justification of this ownership of land by the nobles or the warlords, and the serf and peasants merely survived to perform their labor on the land, of which these warlords or the nobles lived their life of ease on the work done by the peasants and the serfs. And these modes of exploitation in the feudalism at least allowed the peasants and the serfs to perform their labor, and performing the labor or see the product of their labor was also the source of self-consciousness. Whereas in capitalism, we will discuss, and particularly in the next lecture, human alienation, where workers are alienated from the product of their labor itself, and that is worse than the peasants and serfs in feudalism. So, nonetheless, the point is that from the feudalism there is a kind of organization of polity and state which justify such class domination by few over the many. So, the church and the monarchies justified such ownership and control of land as the source of exploitation in the feudalism, which eventually gave rise to capitalism with the technological innovation and changes in trade practices. So, the mercantile capitalism and new modes of trade and business leads to a new modes of production, which is called capitalist modes of production, which emerge out of the ruins of feudalism. So, no longer the land, but the industry or the factory becomes the new center of production, where the working class perform their labor in an alienated form, and it leads through innovation in the production and new ways of social and political organization. In this capitalist mode of production, bourgeoisie is the ruling class which owns or controls the finances, the factories and the tools on which modern industrial production is based. Such ownership enables these bourgeoisie to exploit the workers whose very sustenance depends on the working in these factories. So, its condition is similar to the peasants and the serfs in the feudalism. For their very survival, they must perform their labor in the land. Similarly, in the capitalist modes of production, the worker must work in the factory for their very survival. But the capitalist or the bourgeoisie who owns that property or that modes of production do not necessarily contribute in the production process, and yet exploit the workers because they could not own the property or the means of production. So, Marx, however, believed that the capitalism taught the man the techniques of production. So, in the capitalist modes of production, there is no scarcity of product. So, it is no longer characterized by scarcity as in the feudalism or during the slavery or the primitive communism, but of economic inequalities and disparities. So, the problem of capitalist mode of production is not the scarcity of the goods. So, with the technological innovation and the production process, there is the abundance of production. The problem with capitalism is that of economic inequalities and disparities, where the majority of population lose the purchasing power and live in the condition of servitude. So, the goods are there in the market, but the people do not have the resources and the means to purchase those goods, and that is the new problem, new challenge in the capitalism, which is not of scarcity, but the problem of economic disparities and inequalities. Thus, Marx believed that the capitalism could not be the final stage of human history. It would necessarily and inevitably pave the way for a more advanced and emancipatory state of history, which he calls communism. And communism would be a classless, stateless society with the collective ownership of production, and in the absence of private property there would be no conflicts, hence no need for state and politics in that society. Human beings would be more free, and it would be based on the idea of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So, human being, while performing their labor, doing what they think is their need, and the labor is performed to satisfy the needs and not for the profit or maximization of profit as in the capitalism. That society would be much more free and emancipatory society for the human being. This Marx provides a definite understanding of human history and its different stages of evolution. So, from the primitive communism to communism after capitalism, there is a kind of progressive movement in history, and there is a kind of definite explanation for the movement or evolution of these stages. This influenced many revolutions and epoch-making events in the 20th century, such as Chinese and Russian Revolution. However, these countries were mostly agrarian or partially industrial. So, as per Marx's logic, the revolution should have happened in the advanced industrial countries in the West, particularly in the England. But that was not the actual historical development. The revolution, according to Marx's principle, happened in the mostly agrarian or partially developed industrial society, which often leads to authoritarianism and failed experiment in the communism. Thus, many scholars question the economic determinism in Marxist historical materialism as a reductionist argument. So, everything is reduced to the economic base, and many Marxist also and non-Marxist scholars criticize such reductionist or the deterministic understanding of historical materialism in Marx. It could be a method of understanding historical changes and transformation, but it is not and should not be taken as the law or the definite law of history applicable to all societies across the history. So, when we talk about historical materialism in Marx, we should use it as a method to understand social progress, to understand the functioning of any society, to understand its overall transformation over a period of time. But it cannot be a kind of definite guide to understand the social movement as inevitable, as something which necessarily lead to from one stage to the next stage. That kind of argument have been criticized by many scholars, including the Marxists, but historical materialism nonetheless is a helpful guide to understand the functioning of the society and its measured changes and transformations happening over a period of time, and it should be taken as that, not really as a guide of action and having a very sure deterministic kind of understanding that one society within this condition will certainly and necessarily lead to the other condition. So there is a kind of challenge or criticism to such deterministic or reductionist understanding of historical materialism in Marx. So it's a kind of method, not a kind of definite tool or scientific tool, so to say, of changing the world or transforming the world through human action, mobilization, revolution, wars, and so on. So that's all on Marx's historical materialism. To understand more on this, you should refer to some of these texts like Shlomo Avineri, The Social and Political Thought of Karl Marx, David Butcher and Paul Kelly, Political Thinkers from Socrates to the Present. Gerald A. Cohen gives you a much more detailed account of historical explanation in Marx. So Karl Marx Theory of History, a Defense, you should refer to. And you can also refer to Shefali Jha, Western Political Thought from the Ancient Greeks to Modern Times, and David McLellan, Karl Marx, His Life and Thought, you should refer to, and also James Allen Wren on Politics, and Peter Singer, Marx, A Very Short Introduction, Oxford University Press. So these are some of the texts you can refer to understand more on Marx, his personal life, his social, political and intellectual context, and also particularly his views on historical materialism. So that's all in this lecture today. Do share your comments and feedbacks. We will be happy to hear and respond to. Thanks for listening. Thank you all.